and then I will start recording here. Okay. Welcome to Tuesday. I am super happy to have an invited speaker here today, but I'm not going to introduce him yet. I'm going to introduce him at the end of my slides because first I had a few housekeeping things. So the first thing I wanted to mention was you might have seen this in the news recently, that there was it's a 100 level math course. Over 100, or I think 100 students are accused of cheating. And I found that interesting in itself. But the reason I wanted to bring it up is there is ongoing discussion about online proctoring and how it might help reduce cheating, but it can be extremely invasive. You know, you have to you basically have to show the room to the computer, and there's a lot of problems. But if there were AI solutions, it's possible you would be able to do proctoring without having those same kind of privacy concerns if they were fully automated. But for now, chances are you're really going to need teams of AIs and humans to try to catch cheating, in which case I don't see an obvious way to get around privacy problems. But I'm glad at least that U of A is giving us the option on whether or not we're using these proctoring programs. And it seems like most computer scientists understand that they are not very privacy friendly. So I would personally rather risk having more people cheat than forcing people to install software on their computer that could have backdoors and forcing them to show someone their face in their room and their surroundings. But that's just me. Okay, so off of my soapbox, back into class. We have our final round of paper presentations on Thursday. And hopefully you all are, those of you who are talking on Thursday, have chatted with each other about what order you want to go in and roughly how long you think you're going to spend to try to get everything into that 80 minutes. I have put a Doodle link in Discord in general and asked you to sign up for 2 papers or projects that you would like to review. So all of the draft project write-ups are in eClass. You're welcome to read and review any of them, but I've asked you to do at least 2 to make sure that everyone gets a few of these. And I've also posted I called it a rubric, but it's really just a series of questions, prompts to help you talk about the paper. And the goal of this, again, is to give people constructive feedback so that their paper is that much better when they submit the final thing. So you are welcome to give feedback in any way you want to, whatever you think will be most useful. But I think the kind of prompts I gave you could help with that. So I'm asking you to upload or review these papers by the end of Saturday, put the reviews in eClass, and then I'll distribute them directly to all the students. This will also give you a sense of the kinds of things I think I'll be looking at when I look at the final paper. But I will also make comments on all your papers and get those to you by end of day, or get those to you next Sunday as well. So thank you for those of you who have already signed up. You can see we have a bunch of projects, and I'm just asking you to choose 2. The last person or 2, there may not be enough slots. So if you don't have, if you're not able to choose 2 papers, please just ping me and we can decide which projects will get a 4th review. The other thing I wanted to mention is there was another Doodle on Discord talking about the final presentations. So after our discussion last time, we were thinking about, do you want to do live or record video? Do we want to do Q&A as a class or do these smaller poster things? And I realized I was assuming we would do this all the last week of class, but I thought, well, maybe if some of you are in the same situation as me, where you still think it's early October, maybe having an extra week for that presentation might be useful. So what I was thinking is taking the 2 classes next week, and instead of doing presentations then, do them the week after, but that means it would be during exam period. So I'm sure we'd be able to find some time that fits everyone, but there's always a chance that we couldn't. I know some of you might have trips. Well, hopefully not. Some of you may have decided to take trips right after classes end, and I don't want to ruin your plans. So if you are in a situation where you can't present and do this Q&A in the final week of class, please say so on the Doodle or let me know. I'm leaning towards doing things the week after classes, but I know that's not necessarily normal, and I don't want to disadvantage anyone because they weren't expecting that. So looking at the Doodle, if we look at presentation versus video, very similar. I'm leaning towards video because I think that would be kind of cool to have these recordings that, if you agree, I could share with future classes. Looks like most people are leaning towards poster. So that would be kind of cool. I think it would be fun doing that, trying it out, having kind of like a mini conference. And then the vast majority said, I want to present the week after classes. So if you, and again, it's select all that apply. So far, no one has said they can't present the week after classes. And this is an anonymous poll. If you cannot present the week after classes, please check here and or let me know, and we will come up with something else, because I don't want to mess anything up for you. Or if you have other concerns, sometimes there are regulations against having things during exam periods. I haven't asked, so I'm going with the ask for forgiveness, not permission. But if any of you know if I'm breaking some rules that you would be upset about, please let me know that as well. Any comments on this? Questions? Feelings? Okay. Well, feel free to, yeah, Laura?
I was just going to say that I've taken classes before where we present after the classes have officially ended, like a week or so, and it's never been an issue before.
Okay, so then maybe I won't get fired for doing this. Awesome. Okay, so please do answer the Doodle when you get a chance. If you have any concerns, feel free to write in Discord publicly or email me privately. Just let me know. I'd like to do it. It seems like people are leaning towards this the week after classes, but I want to make sure that works for everyone. Because originally I was saying we're going to present next week. If I'm changing things at the very last minute, I better make sure I'm not hurting anyone because of that. All right. So with all of that said, I am excited to present Ian today. Ian Davies is at Second Mind AI, and we've got a Discord channel set up. Ian is going to be focusing on his talk, so I recommend you unmute and just yell out with questions, but I'll also be following Discord and might repeat some of those questions or comments vocally. Ian also said he'd probably be able to go through Discord after the class, so if you had some questions that he wasn't able to cover, he'd be able to talk about them then. But I actually interviewed at Second Mind a number of years ago when it was called Prowler. And they're a company in the UK that I think is doing some awesome stuff. So Ian is a senior machine learning engineer right now, and he has 2 degrees from UCL, University College London. So the first one was in, covering my notes, come back notes. Oh no. Ian, what was your first degree in?
My first degree was in economics. Joined between, well, I spent some time at Columbia in New York as well as in London. And then my secondary was in machine learning.
Yes. And then you did some, after your economics degree, you did some stuff in fintech, which I always think is cool. And then now you're more of a stats and machine learning nerd. But because you're at Second Mind, you're also interested in people. So that's why I was super excited that we could talk to you today about some of the stuff you can discuss publicly. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and hand it over to Ian.
Okay. Hopefully you can all see my screen now.
Yep, you're good.
Just rearranging the selection of windows I have. Cool. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been leading at Second Mind, where we're trying to improve some existing forecasting models by allowing industry experts to influence our models. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we went about this, how the baseline models, how we came to the baseline models, and then how we're building on that. But first, to add to what Matt has given in the introduction, I want to first talk about who we are at Second Mind and sort of where I fit in the organization. So at Second Mind, we aim to empower people to make better decisions using machine learning. So we're essentially a decision-focused company where we're using fundamental research into machine learning and AI to solve challenges in the logistics, supply chain management, and automotive industries. And we're sort of a research-led company, and we have our Second Mind labs where our researchers live. But really, the kind of interaction between research and customer problems is a two-way thing. So whilst we're able to solve problems that we have sort of research that helps us to build models to do this, but equally by interacting with our customers, we find new problems, and then we can go to research, and that helps set our research agenda to work out how we can solve these problems for our customers and hopefully find new customers. I have a pretty good track record in our research. So we published 65 papers with some sort of currently under review at leading conferences, so things like Europe's, AI Stats, ICML, and we also have 18 patents filed. Many of our papers are under the Parallel IO moniker, but now we're publishing a Second Mind, and I think on our website you can find links to all of the papers we publish. We have teams that focus on probabilistic modeling, Bayesian optimization, stochastic optimal control, and reinforcement learning, and sort of bridges from all of these areas to practical problems. We were founded in 2016, and we're based in Cambridge in the UK. And sort of a quick plug that we'll be at Europe's this year. We're sponsoring the event in some capacity, I believe. So we'll have a booth there where we have some demos, and you can come and talk to us and our researchers about what we do and problems beyond, and problems and challenges we're taking on that kind of extend beyond what I'm presenting today. So where I sit in this is I sit as kind of between research and engineering. So I help to take the research that we're doing and find work out how to apply it to real world problems. But I also support the research and help to write papers and build the agents and the algorithms that we're working on to show that our research really works. So with Second Mind covered off, I'm going to talk a bit about how today's going to work. So I'm going to first define the problem we have, and then talk about the baseline machine learning model we're using to solve it, and sort of where there are hopefully some areas where industry experts can step in and help to improve on that model. Then I'll do a very quick literature review. I think at this point in the course, you've read many papers in the area, so I think I do have a couple of new things to point out, but also kind of talking about how we first sort of started thinking about it in the case of the problem I'm going to talk about today. And then sort of the bulk of the talk is about how we did this work with our customers. So how we built the relationship, and how we collected inputs from our users, how we used them in our models, and then how we communicated results back to our customers. And in some cases, it's not always easy to get this data, so we had to simulate our users. And then looking to the future, we're also thinking about capturing uncertainty from the user's perspective, as well as from a modeling perspective, so we can account for different ways our users might want to interact with our models. I think the talk should take about 50 minutes, but there should be time for questions as we go through, and discussion at the end. And this is an ongoing project, so any discussion we have could help to set the future direction of this work, and even some of our research. So yeah, please get involved, and I'll try and keep an eye on Discord as we go through. But before I start talking about the specific problem, I want to talk a little bit about my perspective on interactive machine learning. And I'm going to use an example that we're all familiar with, I hope, of AlphaGo. So AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol at the game of Go in 2016. But as you can see here, there's actually a lot of interaction between AlphaGo and people. And even, AlphaGo has never been presented as an interactive machine learning model, but I think, at some point, all machine learning interacts with people when it's going to have an effect. And here you can see that AlphaGo, the game of Go, is actually being played by a member of the DeepMind team who's reading the outputs of AlphaGo and then placing the stones on the table. And this is kind of a division of tasks based on on which party has the best ability to take that task. So it's actually very hard to train a robot with reinforcement learning or sort of many other techniques to pick up items and place them on a Go board, especially when you have a pot full of stones and you want to pick up one stone, place it on the table without necessarily knowing beforehand how hard the stone is and how much it weighs and things like that. Whereas AlphaGo itself can process many, like it was trained on a database of expert Go players games to start with, to first emulate humans, and then through reinforcement learning start to surpass humans. And in this case, it's kind of two separate tasks where AlphaGo is proposing moves, and then the person is then reading these moves and placing the stones on the board. And you know, I don't necessarily think this is what we think about when we think of humans collaborating with machines, because there's no sort of overlap in the tasks. And I think the true collaboration in the way that we're thinking about it at Second Mind, and the way that I'm going to talk about it today, is where the human and machines are covering similar tasks. And the collaboration is really sort of, there's a lot of overlap, and therefore you need to have strong communication and ways of interacting between your machine learning algorithm and your users. So it's kind of an overview of the way that I think about this, and partly sort of putting something we already know from the machine learning world into a context of interactive machine learning, and seeing where the boundary fits between sort of more standard machine learning and where it comes to interact with people. So that's sort of the introduction, and now I'll introduce the problem we have, and then the baseline model that we're using to solve it before we started trying to get our users involved. So the problem we're talking about today is demand forecasting. So essentially answering the question of how many units of some item will I need to have available in the future? And in the case of logistics, this can be sort of how many ships will I need to move my items from A to B, or how much space do I need to reserve on a plane, and things like that. And it's kind of a fairly standard time series regression problem where you have the observed past, so your observed past instances of the thing you're trying to predict, as well as any kind of relevant side information, and you're trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. But to solve this problem, you ultimately need some metric to optimize. And in our case, we consider the mean absolute percentage error. And it's a metric that's not without its problems, but one thing that's important to note when you're working with customers is that you should always try and pick one metric that you care about, and a metric that both sides understand. And you shouldn't always compromise everything to get to that point. But in this case, with mean absolute percentage error, it's sort of, as a percentage error, it's something that our customers understand, because they often work in percentages, and they can think about how wrong our predictions are, and therefore how that's going to affect their decision making based on these predictions.
Hey, Ian, quick question.
Sure.
I could interpret this two ways. One would be like, well, I need to figure out how much ice cream I'm going to produce because people want to buy the ice cream and I want to sell as much as possible. Another way would be, I want to predict the right number of UPS trucks, because if I don't have enough, I won't get the packages delivered. And if they don't get delivered on Monday, that's going to cascade into Tuesday and cause increased demand. So does your decisions at one time affect the state in future times, or are they all independent?
So in this case, we're considering them as independent.
Okay.
In reality, there is some overlap, but also there's one of the kind of key problems in demand forecasting is that you're essentially modeling a policy rather than the true demand, because the true demand is limited in many ways, because for example, with Amazon, when they run out of stock, demand is higher than they predicted, but they don't know how much higher because they've hit this lower bound.
Oh yeah.
And in our case, like with logistics, how much demand they met in the past. You don't necessarily know how much demand there was in the past. And this is kind of maybe a completely different talk, but it's it is a challenge particularly in demand forecasting. But for the purposes of today, we can think of this as sort of a fairly typical sort of regression problem with time on the x-axis.
Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. There's a question about whether the UPS drivers would be more of a scheduling problem in Discord, and I think So basically what we're trying to do is predict demand, and then the downstream decision making is something that at the moment our customers do, but we're hoping to expand our work to cover those areas in the future. So we also have work on scheduling, but we haven't quite connected everything up yet. Cool, so this is kind of a fairly standard regression problem, but where the nuances come is when you start to consider the data. So here I've simulated some data that captures various aspects of the data we see in reality, and some of the challenges we face. So for example, hopefully, cool. You can see that there are periods where it drops down to 0 for a while and then jumps back up to where it was before. And this kind of happens in various places along the time series. And this is what we call bursty data, where you kind of have, well, it's not quite so extreme in this case, but you have bursts of values and then periods where it's 0. Another thing that's sort of hard to capture in this data is that when we're looking at sort of international logistics and shipping problems, then there are many factors that are hard to reliably capture in the data. So there's things like the weather events, so things that are out of control that are often just treated as random noise, but in many cases, when an event happens, it's very specific. You just can't necessarily, we could predict it from data, but unless we're reading in, loads of data, weather forecasts and things like that, it's sort of hard to capture that in our models. And finally, there's the case of sort of irregular but repeating events. So things like Chinese New Year, which happens every year, but based on a lunar calendar, so it's not the same dates every year. Similarly with Ramadan and Eid. And each of these problems, you can kind of think of ways in which humans would be able to step in and help our models perform better. So for example, with Chinese New Year, we know the date of Chinese New Year next year and the year after that. And we can essentially provide our model with features that that tell us when Chinese New Year is. With the weather and sort of other random events that are going on, our users are like in their day-to-day jobs, they come across like lots and lots of information. So for example, today, I've read the news, I've looked at a weather forecast, and I've done that sort of very casually. I've not even sort of put a lot of effort into doing that, but I'm able to take all of these different resources, synthesize those ideas, and I would be able to say, I now have a view of what the next couple of days might look like based on my understanding of the news and the weather, if it's something I'm trying to look at. So our users might be able to, in a more specific way based on their job, be able to provide some inputs which can help guide our model when our model is sort of lacking a context of the wider world. And finally, with the sort of bursty things, you can see these periods of zeros as usually a reason behind them. Sometimes it's just missing data, but once you've sort of got through cleaning your data, it's often more that, in our case, that a flight has been cancelled, so something didn't get moved from A to B, which is not really the demand problem, it's more not meeting supply, but again, as we've covered, it's kind of, those two things are quite closely linked. And again, our customers are having ongoing discussions with their hauliers and people like that. That means that they will have some insight into this perhaps before they happen. Even if it's quite soon before it happens, they will still be able to step in and say, this is going to affect things, and then the downstream process can then take what comes out of our models with this human interaction and then build a better plan. So I kind of summarize it in these bullet points here. So I'm not going to repeat myself, but you have the slide, so hopefully this will come back to you when you look at it in the future. So that's the problem from a sort of defining it and the data perspective. And then how did we first get about solving this? So our original model was a Gaussian process regression model. So on the right, I've plotted a Gaussian process regression task where the data points are shown by the x's, and then your prediction is given by this blue line. So the blue line is essentially the median prediction or the modal prediction, so your best prediction and also your average prediction. And the shaded region is a 95% confidence interval about all of these points. So when you're getting a prediction here, you're not just getting a single point value, you're getting a full distribution of points. So this is what a Gaussian process looks like, but what is it mathematically? So a Gaussian process is a Bayesian non-parametric model. So essentially, we learn from data alone. There are hyperparameters, but ultimately, there are no parameters in the model. and it's defined as the distribution over functions, where this distribution is defined by a mean function and a kernel function. So the mean function choice is usually not too influential because of the power of a kernel function. So the kernel function is essentially affecting the shape of likely functions from your probability distribution. And when you're drawing, or you're sort of evaluating your model, you're drawing from a joint normal distribution where the function values are normally distributed with your mean as your mean function evaluated as your input points, and your covariance is given by evaluating your kernel function at each pair, like each of your input points in a pairwise way. So to sort of summarize the way that the kernels affect your what kind of the shape of the functions you get out looks like. Here on the left, I've plotted some kernels where you have so essentially fixing one x point at 0 and letting the other one vary. This is how much will your y values covary with one another for these two x values. So how similar will your y values be for these two x values? And on the right, I've sort of drawn samples from a Gaussian process with these kernels, like defined by these kernels. And you can see that you can get different shapes of functions, and they can capture different things like smoothness on different scales. And in the case of a periodic function, you can have a repeating pattern that can repeat at different time scales. So you might have an annually repeating pattern or a weekly repeating pattern, and you can actually learn how often this pattern should repeat through given your data. So there's been a sort of very quick introduction to Gaussian processes. There's a lot more detail in the appendix, and I've linked to a couple of demonstrations here and some other slides. For anyone who's more interested, if there's some time at the end of this talk, I'm sort of happy to talk about these in more details. But what's important for the moment is why Gaussian processes are well suited to this problem. So first, they're extremely data efficient. So we're not always given a lot of data from our customers, and this is also important when you're considering human interaction, and that it's often quite expensive or difficult to get values from humans. So being very data efficient is very useful to us. Secondly, building the kernel at the heart of the model is sort of very interpretable and flexible. So as I was talking about with the periodic function, you can talk about what the period is, and you can get an intuitive idea of, okay, there's some annual seasonality, but there's also some weekly effects where weekends might be different from weekdays. And finally, you're getting a full distribution out, which you can view as getting a notion of uncertainty. So in our case, we can kind of try to prompt for human input at points where our model predictions are particularly uncertain. And equally, when our users are giving us points, we can say, because we have a full distribution coming out, we can say, the point you're giving us are original predictions, which give this a very low probability of actually happening. Is this consistent with the kind of information you're trying to give our models? So essentially, this is how we sort of started solving the problem before we even had humans in the loop. But and on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how these models achieve. So the model performance was quite varied between sort of 10% and 50% error, so 10% being quite good in this case and 50% not being very good at all. And in general, the models are more accurate where we have sort of greater aggregation. So you can consider, if we're considering trade between Germany and the UK, this is aggregating all of the trade between airports and ports in Germany and airports and ports in the UK. So that's sort of, you're averaging out a lot of noise in this case, and then our models do very well. But if you consider trade between Frankfurt and Felixstowe, so port in Germany and port in the UK, for a specific customer, then there's a lot more noise because this customer might have its own shocks, and each of these ports might have various things going on. Overall, we're trying to target approximately 30% accuracy. So we're doing well in some cases, but not well enough in others. Cool. So,
sorry, quick question.
Sure.
Could you very briefly go back to the metric you're measuring? It's not the mean squared error. It's like the percentage difference or percentage error.
Just the absolute percentage error.
So does that mean that there's going to be, if you're off by 10 units, that's not what's important. It's whether if you're off by 10 and you get 10 instead of 0, that's much more important than 100 versus 90. Am I interpreting that right?
Yes. I mean, in the case of 10 versus 0, you're like this, the metric's not defined.
Well, yeah, 10 versus 1 then, let's say.
Yeah. So yeah, and in that case, it's also something that's leveled at this metric as an error, as an issue, because if you're underestimating, you can only underestimate by as much as, like, so you can only get sort of minus 100%, whereas on the upside, you can overpredict by sort of arbitrary amounts. And in fact, we use a slight variant of MAPE, which gets around some of these issues. But yeah, that is essentially, you're looking at the percentage error, and you're essentially weighting time series. Well, if you're averaging over time series, you're also weighting time series with more values, like more volume, more heavily in your metrics. Well, depending on how you do the average, but yeah, essentially your intuition is correct that it's a relative error, not an absolute error.
Okay, cool. That makes sense. And then there were a couple of questions. One of them was, so I'm definitely not a GP expert, but one person points out that inverting the kernel can be expensive. Is that still a thing that's really expensive, or if we're comparing to deep neural networks, it's trivial?
So Gaussian processes, as I've explained them, do have scaling issues, but we've done a lot of work to make Gaussian processes scale to sort of, I think, millions of data points now. And in the traditional setting, yes, inverting this matrix is the bottleneck, but there are techniques to get around that. So using things like inducing points and sort of more, yeah, it gets a lot more complicated, but you can make them scale essentially.
Okay, cool. And then the other question is, you said you were going for around 30% accuracy. What's state of the art? I mean, I'm guessing there are either hand predictions or other systems that make these predictions.
So not on the data. Well, okay. So the data we have is customer data, so it's not publicly available. So the only baselines we have are baselines that we've run.
Okay.
And until we started incorporating human input, this was as good as it got from neural nets, GPs, random forest regression, just predicting the average, which is a surprisingly powerful model in some cases, it turns out. But, well, maybe not powerful, but surprisingly accurate. So yeah, this is the best we could do with machine learning on its own.
I see. So I'm guessing in in-demand forecasting, people are typically working on their own data sets. There's not some standard set of data set that everyone compares against, like MNIST or things like that.
So more recently, there have been competitions around this. So I think there's I'm not sure how often it happens, but there's a time series competition, prediction competition run a bit like a Kaggle competition it's named after someone whose name they can't pronounce. So it's known as the M4 model or M4 dataset and the M5 dataset, where you're essentially taking lots of time series with different things and looking at models that perform well or not. I think the latest one has demand forecasting from Walmart or eBay or some big retailer. And yeah, can you model their data? But there's also, like, Amazon publishes a lot of work on this. They don't reveal their data, but provided you trust the researchers there, they're comparing to a lot of baselines and talking about the issues they have, and they have alternative approaches that handle the bursty nature of data, and they deal with different likelihood functions. And they take a probabilistic approach rather than using neural nets, at least in the works that I'm familiar with.
Okay, cool.
So there is public data, but our data is not public. Indeed, we're not allowed to share it even if we wanted to. So,
yeah. Well, until you show me results on Atari, I'm not going to believe it.
Okay.
Sorry, in paper reviewing mode. Stupid reviewer number 2. Graham, do you want to unmute and ask your question? I didn't quite understand it.
Sure. So you mentioned that you had differing results, some getting kind of a 10% loss and some getting 50%. Was there any underlying pattern to which ones did very well and which ones did very poorly?
Yeah. So in general, we do better where we're considering what I've sort of said here is like greater levels of aggregation. So if we're considering trade between whole regions rather than trade between specific ports, for example, we do much better, and that's partly because a lot of noise is averaged out. But also there's just like the data series are higher quality and there's more, or there's generally more volume, and we're able to do more with the data in those cases. So there is a general trend towards where we're looking at sort of wider areas, then we're performing better, but in more sort of, I guess, idiosyncratic cases, we do a lot worse, and that's kind of understandable because there's a lot more sort of randomness in the events that happens. Because if you're looking at for a specific customer, that customer will have their own contracts and their own perhaps a smaller user base, which will then define how much they're needing to, how much demand there is at any given time in a different way to sort of on a population level, where if you look at all of trade between two countries, that happens, that has more like clear drivers than you know, the weather's good, I'm going to go and buy beer, so the beer company has higher demand, which actually fits into what I'm sort of about to talk about, where why we think that industry professionals can also help us here is because the places where our model does badly are also where we think our customer has more knowledge, because the professionals tend to work at this sort of lower level where they deal with individual customers and individual trade routes. So they have knowledge at a granular level, and they also have sort of decades of experience with intuitions and the nuances of their particular area. And we then want to enable these experts to sort of impart this information to our models. And sort of the challenge is how to make this technically possible within our models, but also cognitively possible for our users. So we want to make it easy for our users to articulate what they know, and then easy for our models to read that in and use that in a meaningful way. And that's essentially sort of where the machine learning needs to meet the users, and where you know, it's often the difficult part is making these things match up in expectation. So is the user providing what our models expect, and do our models expect what the user provides? So that's the end of sort of the introduction to the problem and the data set. I'll just check if there are any questions. I think Discord is, we've covered everything there. So I have a one-side literature review, which will be very quick. But I'll highlight a couple of things that I think will be important to some of you in particular, given the little knowledge I have of the course so far. So when we had these models and we looked at how we could incorporate the knowledge that our users have into them, we first sort of looked at how people had done this previously. And the bad news was that there's not many cases, or any really, that we found useful of this happening in a regression model. I may be wrong, and feel free to point me to papers if there are, but cases of doing regression with human input are kind of few and far between. So we kind of took a more general approach and read quite widely, and I kind of summarized 3 common approaches that we've seen in the literature to letting users articulate their views or be helped by machine learning. And the first is treating the humans as an expert and querying that. So in active learning, you can kind of iteratively build up a data set in this way by asking humans for input and essentially treating that input as the true answer, the true label for a value. There's sort of other cases where you can have sort of human-derived training signals, so things like Tamer, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but also more recently, some work by OpenAI where they learn a reward model based on human preferences to help text summarization. So essentially, in a case where there's no well-defined reward function, can you learn one from people and then use that to train to train your model that would originally be done in a supervised way, but now in kind of a reinforcement learning way, given some human signaling. And finally, you can ensemble humans and machines. So there's a paper of learning to defer to experts where if the machine learning model is unsure, you can just query a human instead, or similarly trying to complement. So learn what the human's data set is, the human's skills are, and then learn a machine learning model that sort of fills in the gaps in some way. So that's essentially one way of viewing it. An alternative way is that you can treat your users as autonomous agents. And sort of the canonical case of this would be cooperative inverse reinforcement learning. So in this case, you'll have an RL agent who's essentially modeling the user's reward function and then trying to take actions to try and achieve some goal in a cooperative way by helping them achieve their goal, having first inferred the goal. The second is sort of correcting for human biases and errors. So often humans will have heuristics that might be flawed, and perhaps we can learn a machine learning model that can model sort of true dynamics better than human heuristics and then correct for that. There's this paper by Siddharth Reddy at Berkeley that I would sort of really recommend to anyone. I think he does some experiments on the lunar lander game, which I think I saw in Discord some of you are working on for your projects. And even though he's doing different things, I think his work is particularly interesting. And finally, you can kind of simplify the representation for the user. So instead of, in cases where you have a large data set and the user needs to make a decision, wading through all this data can be quite time consuming and have require a lot of effort. So can you summarize it in some way that helps the user make good decisions? So can you learn perhaps a clustering technique or a way of visualizing the data that helps the users make decisions? And there's been some recent work in that area. And finally, linking back to a talk that was earlier in the course, I think Corey Mathewson was talking about how you can put humans in the loop everywhere, or all machine learning is human in the loop machine learning. And there are some frameworks that take this view and essentially empower users who may have sort of limited engineering skills to sort of step in and articulate their view on how to do machine learning in lots of different ways without necessarily writing the algorithm themselves. And this is, these are all different ways of doing it, but none of them sort of were directly applicable to what we're trying to do. But we kind of progressed with an awareness of what had happened and then sort of tried to build from there. Cool, so that's the end of the background section. I'll pause to see if there are any questions. Cool. Okay, so now I'll talk a bit about how we got this to work with our customers. With an understanding of the problem that we have so far, and then looking at how we try to solve it with machine learning and what has existed out there in the world, we then propose to our customers that they have all of this information. Perhaps they'll be able to help our models, and our models can help them, and we can build some sort of collaborative relationship. And in doing this, it's kind of different to a more typical customer relationship where they give you data and you give them back forecasts, and sometimes they want explainability, but oftentimes they're happy to treat your models as a black box so long as it works well. But in this case, we're trying to build an ongoing relationship with our user where the machine learning and the user can sit side by side and generate better and better forecasts through time. And one thing that's important to sort of build this relationship is mutual understanding. So understanding of the metric, as I talked about earlier, but also understanding of the problem and what your objectives are. So it's important to point out at the start of any process what the objectives are and agree them, and then also find the realm of what's possible. So people will have a lot of different ideas about what's possible with machine learning at the moment. Some people think it's sort of oversold and is not actually going to achieve much, and some people think it can solve everything very easily. And customers are also very often optimistic about how good their data is and how much they can offer you. So as I've said here, the relationship revolves around setting these objectives and keeping them clear, managing expectations, and continued engagement, which is sort of more than just turning up to meetings and communicating, but really sort of buying into that conversation and trying to put as much in and get as much out as you can. And I think the particular point here is managing expectations, where especially if your users are going to give you input, they're going to expect some important performance benefits from that in terms of reducing the error of your models. But whilst it's kind of in the research phase, you can't make any promises about how much better your models might be. And similarly, you're going to want to expect some data from your users on a sort of reliable basis so that you can continue to build your models and improve them. And I'll talk a little bit about how we think about this and how we get around some of the issues there in some later slides.
And that's actually related to a question I had earlier, where you said you want this 30% accuracy. I could see either you want to achieve this accuracy or you want to be able to be better than whatever was happening before. So if they were 2% accurate and now you're 10% accurate, maybe that's a win.
Yeah, that's definitely true. You want to be better than what they have already. But in our case, given that we're kind of looking at the whole system they have, it's first, can we be accurate enough that we're improving the decisions they make downstream? So like, if you're 2% accurate and you're making bad decisions because your forecasts are essentially wrong, then being 10% accurate, are your forecasts now good enough that you can make better decisions? And that means that you can, you don't have to send trucks everywhere to pick up possible packages, but you can target where you're sending them, and therefore you need fewer trucks, and therefore you can save money, or you can save mileage, or things like that. Like, at what point are you accurate enough to have that benefit?
So could I say that the accuracy metric is really kind of an intermediate thing, and ultimately you want to measure the quality of the decisions made?
Yeah, but it's much easier to measure accuracy than quality of decisions. And also, given that we're looking at the sort of ultimately looking to make decisions in the end, but customers, you can build confidence by showing that you're accurate. Because if you're recommending a decision, but they think that you have some forecast behind it, but they don't know that the forecast is right, and they don't want to just take your decision at face value, it's useful to first understand, okay, so your forecasts are accurate, we trust your models, therefore we trust you to help us make decisions. And I think forecasting is probably the first thing that people are willing to sort of let machine learning take over, and decisions is something that people like to hold on to, because ultimately, if you make the wrong decision, if you're going to blame your algorithms, then ultimately someone gets blamed, not an algorithm. And that's something you have to be very sensitive about when you're thinking about these systems in the real world. It's not, so accuracy is an intermediate, but it's a very useful one.
Well, and if this is too off topic, feel free to defer me to later, but do you try to measure user trust? Because if you are having this ongoing engagement, it seems like somehow estimating that and seeing how it changes over time might be useful.
We don't. If you have a good way of doing it, let me know. But we kind of, it's something you can gauge from your discussions, but it's not always, we don't have a sort of metric for that.
Okay.
But I'll talk a little later about confidence, but in a different dimension.
Okay. Thank you.
So yeah, we have this foundation of sort of mutual understanding and expectations, but then sort of in the specific case of your users interacting with your models, this question of, do they need to understand your models to provide useful input? So you could, like, in some cases yes, in some cases no. And so I kind of take both views here. So if your user doesn't understand the model and they're trying to provide adjustments or forecasts, it can be problematic. For example, we're coming up to the holiday season, where typically you would expect to see a rise in sales of items of people buying presents. And if the user says, okay, I expect a big increase at this time of year because of the seasonal effect, I'm going to make my forecast higher. But what if the model's already capturing that because it has a history of data and the cyclical effect, then you're essentially double counting for that. So you're going to over predict. And this is a very simple case, but it happens in more nuanced ways, and also with more complex interactions where you're having multiple inputs, and you might affecting one of them might affect the relationship between several of the other ones, and then you basically don't want to allow your users would need to understand how your model's working to be able to provide a useful input in this case. And that's partly based on the way you're collecting inputs. So if you're allowing them to adjust forecasts, then they need to understand how those forecasts are arrived at to usefully adjust them. But also, as I'll touch on in the next slide, perhaps you can collect model inputs in a model agnostic way, and then they don't need to understand it. And I think that's kind of a good place to be, but because if you think about, if your model understands your model and its flaws, then maybe they're able to game the system. And by this, I mean kind of get out of the system what they want, rather than what your system is sort of truly and in a statistically reasoned way trying to tell them. And you could say this is not really a problem, because if your users and your model are both trying to get accurate forecasts, then it's fine, you have the same objective. But where the problem comes when these objectives diverge, and this can happen in cases where, for example, if there's a new launch of an iPhone and everyone wants one, and you have managers in different countries, trying to get their hands on as many as possible to keep their customers happy, so that they can fill their stores. But so each country manager then has an incentive to increase their forecast, so they can say, look, my forecasts are really high, there's really, really high demand, so give me as many as possible. And then you're trying to, and then if you're getting this out of a machine learning model, okay, look, I've told my model, and my model is giving me these forecasts, you better believe them. And in this case, they're not necessarily trying to find accurate forecasts, they're trying to find forecasts that give them the result they want. So perhaps a slightly fanciful example, but there are cases where you don't necessarily want to just let your users manipulate your system in a way that provides some statistical validity to something that's really they've just made up. And also, if they want to just have if they want to have a forecast, they can make up whatever they want, and then they don't need a forecasting model. So at some point, you really want to think about what the use case is and how they're really using your system. But also, this is an ongoing process. So through time, your users are adapting to how your model works, and your model is, with more and more data, learning how your users are working. And this creates some non-stationarity, and as is quite often the case in machine learning, we're kind of ignoring the non-stationarity here. And the reason we're doing this is because we think that there's some co-adaptation. So our models are learning how to use our data. Our models are using how to use the inputs our users are giving us more accurately, and the users are learning how to provide inputs in a way that helps our models be more accurate. So it's kind of a beneficial adaptation through time, rather than sort of harmful non-stationarity where the true relationship is changing fundamentally. And as I was mentioning on the previous slide, it's also important to try and gather model agnostic inputs, partly because it removes some of the need to understand the models, but also because it helps to allow for you to adjust your models in future. So if you have if you've been collecting data in a model agnostic way for a long time, if you decide to try a new model or change a model, you can use all of the data you've already collected for the future model. And when I talk about how we're using the input they gave us, we moved from a less model agnostic way to now a fully model agnostic way of collecting inputs. And this is sort of helping us in the future as we're developing more models. So that's kind of covering how we think about the relationship between our models and our users, and how we're trying to manage that, and think about the problems that can arise, and also sort of the longer term issues of how these things develop through time. But with that in mind, we actually sort of got out there and collected input from our users as a first step, sort of trying to get something off the ground quickly to help our users interact with our models and start to understand the problem more in a more meaningful way. So we first started by just letting our users modulate our forecasts. So say, if our forecasts were wrong, they could overwrite them, and we could kind of gather information about where we were wrong, and then try and improve our models in that way. But also, if they could provide this information ahead of time, you can kind of see, okay, so they know that something's going on here. But it was also kind of an exercise in getting the users to play with our models and understand them in a way which, so when you're using models, it's far more intuitive to play around with them and look at the results, rather than just have a presentation once a week where a modeler like me comes along and says, we've done this stuff with your models and now they're 10% more accurate. And what does that mean? Okay, they're better, fine, let's move on. But if you're actually playing with them and trying to use what's coming out of them, then you get a lot more engagement. So here on the right is a plot where there's a spike, and the user essentially says, at this point, I actually expect a much higher forecast than you're giving me, because there's some underlying event that means there's going to be this big spike here. And you can see we've adapted the original forecast, which is in black, to this green forecast where sort of you're predicting a much higher event now, and essentially you've allowed a human override. And this is also something that's kind of fairly standard in existing demand, non-machine learning demand planning software. So kind of also at least giving them what they expect as an initial point before we start doing something more intelligent. One problem we had here is that, okay, this is one example where we've given, one input can have a significant impact on overall accuracy. But so again, it's only one time series and one sample of expert input at one point in time and one way of using it. So, there's a very small sample size, and you can, again, have to manage the expectations of the user to say, yes, we're a lot more accurate here, but we can't expect this across the board and all the way into the future, but it is showing that there's some promise for you to influence our models. I'll notice the question in the Discord, which I'm kind of about to cover in the next slide. In the next couple of slides, actually. So this is that intervention sort of zoomed in, I guess. And you can see there's this one week where we're changing the forecast, and then we go back to our original predictions, even though there's actually this spike that has a longer lasting effect. And equally, this is sort of a model dependent input, because it's changing our forecast. But we said, well, okay, if you're changing our forecast, you have in mind a point which you're trying to get to. And what if we just took that point as that was observed and pass that into our model and train with that point? And then you get something like this. So this red triangle denotes the same point, but now treated as an observation, but the observation is in the future. So we call this pseudo observations, where now we're having an observed point in the future, and it's having a much more dramatic impact on our model. So if you look at the green lines of the forecast in just having the modulation versus the pseudo input, it's actually pulling up all of the points around it. And we're able to do this because Gaussian processes let you pass in input points at any point in time. I guess you could do this with sort of a lot of time series models, where if you have something like a recurrent neural net, you have to then wait till that time point happens to then pass in your additional input. But here we can treat it as an input where it's affecting the times before as well as after, and it's pulling up the predictions at every point in the prediction window. Yeah, so, and then you're as a user, you're getting a lot more bang for your buck. You're giving one input point and it's affecting many forecasts. And also for us, this is now model agnostic, because it's just a point in space. You're saying at week 138, I expect a value of 180, I think. And we can then use that in any of our models in any way we would like. Whereas previously you're saying your forecast is 20% too low. Like you need to adjust your forecast, which is dependent on the forecast, which is dependent on the model. Whereas in this way, we now have a more powerful technique, which is doing actual machine learning, because you're learning a relationship between the additional point and the change you need in your data. And as we get more and more of these interventions, we can improve this change. But also we can use this as we sort of change the model and learn new models. And we don't have to go to the user and say, we're thinking of trying a different model. Can you give us all of these different inputs in a different way? Which is a lot of time and effort for them, and equally something that we have to do without necessarily being able to say how this new model is going to work.
So if the user gives a pseudo observation at 180, and then you go forward in time and it's actually 250, what happens? Do you throw out that 180?
So once it's actually happened, then yeah, we would say we would take what really happened as the observation, because we continue to be forward looking, and we take the past as the ground truth because it's actually happened. But it's not something we've run into too much yet. But there's some ideas that you could say, well, depending on the underlying motivation for why they provided input, you could then look at whether you should persist that into the future. Because say they predicted a spike, but it didn't actually happen, maybe they just mistimed the prediction, and actually the spike is coming in a few weeks. Should you try and adjust for it in an ongoing basis? But then how do you do that? It's not something we've really solved yet. But yeah, once we have something that's observed, we kind of take that as verbatim and go from there.
Cool.
And sorry, I was also going to say that we can look at how accurate our users are, and then essentially build a model of our users based on that, and then how much should we trust them in future. But then that's also difficult, because should you tell your users that you don't trust them anymore? It's probably not something you should do, especially in a commercial relationship. So there are models that do that, but it's not something we're doing at the moment.
Yeah, so I could see a model saying, I trust Ian more than Matt. It seems like that would be really useful. Could a user say, it's going to be 180 plus or minus 50, or 180 plus or minus 5? So could they have those inherent uncertainties kind of factored in?
You're a few slides too early with your question.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. But yeah, that's something we're looking at now at the moment, actually. So I will revisit this question when we get to that point. Cool. So this is we went from a model where we were just letting the users adjust their forecast to now one where they're providing pseudo observations, and we're treating those as observations of the future. So we asked our users to start working with our models in a different way, and this involved some changes on their side to their workflows and things like that. So we needed to motivate it. So we gave an example like this, showing that now we're actually doing machine learning, and by giving one input point, you're helping us to change the whole forecast. And in this case, it's much more accurate, and we believe that in future, on an ongoing basis, it could be much more accurate. And this is also using the sort of underlying machine learning technology that we've built. And due to Gaussian processes, we'll touch on in a bit later, there are actually many ways you can treat these input points differently, and we can have a much more powerful model than you just adjusting our forecast and essentially doing the work of the model for it. But these changes, there's usually a series of meetings where you sort of propose the changes, motivate them, and then ask for the input. And this is sort of something that you continue to do as you sort of have to explain why you're making the changes and why it's beneficial to change the way that you're working. Cool. So that's sort of the initial steps we had in getting to work with our users. And one of the reasons why they were sort of enthusiastic about starting to use pseudo observations rather than just adjustments is because they could get a lot more output in terms of changing the forecast from one input, and they didn't have to interact with our models too often, so they could kind of freed up time to do other things and didn't have to constantly be adjusting forecasts. But even then, there's not it's hard to collect a lot of data, especially in time series where depending on how often you're monitoring things, you have to wait for a period of time until you see what really happened, and also wait for a period of time to get inputs on an ongoing basis. Because if they're providing event-driven inputs, if they're going to give you, if they're trying to tell you about weather events, there may only be a few storms a year, and you're going to have to wait years and years till you get lots of input. So what can we do to simulate users? So this is an example, very sort of toy data set where it's essentially a sine wave with some noise added. And we sort of trained a model on it and made a prediction here. The prediction is the black line, but what really happened is this blue line. And I've shaded here a purple region where our models does particularly badly. So what we do when we're trying to simulate X-ray inputs, we say we have this whole history of data and we can run a backtest on it and see where our models do well and see where they do badly. And then when our models do particularly badly, perhaps there are points where we could get a lot of benefit from providing input. And then we can say, we know what really happened because it's a backtest, so we know the future from the perspective of the past, if that makes sense. And you can say, well, let's sample a point based on what really happened. And then given that you're simulating all of this, you can change the way that your users are essentially working with your model. So you can say, maybe our users are very accurate, or maybe they're inaccurate, and they might know the direction of change, but they don't know the exact point you're going to reach. Or they might provide, over a full time series, they might provide, maybe 1 or 2 inputs a year, or maybe they'll provide an input every week. And that you can look at these things and see how it affects your model accuracy and also your expectations of your customer. And then you can arrive at meetings and talk about, you can essentially pick your battles in whether you want more accurate inputs or you want more frequent inputs. And you can build some expectation from the user about, if you're giving me these things, this is approximately how much it's going to affect the model error. So we can do this because we have all of the history of time series, and also helps us where we're looking forward to the future. So now our customers are providing us inputs about the future, but in the past, we don't have any input from our users, and it's very time consuming for them to go back and think, what did I know in January 2016? And what inputs could I have provided then? It's very difficult for them to do. And it's kind of the underlying assumption here is that when our models are wrong, it's perhaps because there's some event happening, or some the time series is there's something our models aren't capturing, and we're assuming that the user might have some insight at these points, given that it's not business as usual, or at least under business as usual, we're predicting quite well, but in these cases, perhaps something is going wrong. So we're perhaps being over optimistic in that we can say our users can be helpful at all of these times, but equally, if there are times when they know they couldn't have helped us, we can account for that in our simulations. Cool. So we've talked about the data they gave us and the data we can simulate. And now we're going to talk a little bit about Matt's question, where he was asking about what if they're not sure how high it's going to be, or they think it's going to be within some region. And we view this as trying to capture the uncertainty of the user inputs. So users might be more or less certain about the provided pseudo observations, and that's usually because they're more or less certain about the side information they have. So for example, they might expect that they know there's going to be stormy weather next week, but they're not sure how stormy it's going to be. So how many boats might be affected, and how many planes might not be able to take off. So they think there's going to be an impact on shipment, or they think or they know that there's going to be a launch of a new product next week, but they're not sure how high demand is going to be for it. So they know there's going to be a jump, but they're not sure how high the jump is going to be. So we want to let them influence our models, but we don't want needing to be certain to be a barrier to using our models. And because we're getting out a distribution, because we're taking a Bayesian approach, it means that there are many ways in which we can incorporate these kind of uncertain user inputs into our models. Sort of a simple way would be uncertainty-aware model averaging, where you're essentially performing model averaging, but your weights in the average are how certain you are about the forecast you're giving. So if you're highly certain and the model is uncertain, then you're going to weight more towards the user input, and vice versa. But sort of what we do in what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides is we use heteroscedastic likelihoods to train our Gaussian processes. So this is essentially saying, as I was saying, when we have a point in the future that we treat as an observation, you can treat different points as having different levels of observation noise. So you can say the past is certain, that has very low observation noise, but in the future, our users have different observation noise, and perhaps they can tell us a bit of how certain they are, and then we can map that to some sort of level of noise. And they can have a different level of noise for each point if necessary. And we're currently doing this by requesting sort of infinite intervals for a given confidence interval. So saying, yeah, I expect it to be 50, but I'm 90% certain it's going to be between 40 and 60. And this has some benefits in that you can capture skew as well, because you can say, I expect it to be 50, but I'm 90% confident it's going to be between 40 and 80. And then there's some more headroom, but it's not going to fall that far. And there is some evidence that humans can be good at estimating their certainty or uncertainty. And there's also evidence that the confidence in which they provide their estimates is correlated with their accuracy. So the closer they are to the true value, the more confident they tend to be about it. And this happens in cases for forecasting as well as sort of behavior and well, they're actually experiments in these kind of things are sort of very ingenious, but they have mappings to sort of forecasting and as well as sort of world dynamic estimation and sort of decision-making aspects, but we're mostly interested in the forecasting stuff here. So what does this look like? Oh no, wait, before I get there, is there a difference between being uncertain about the level of impact or the timing of an impact? And kind of, I guess it's an open question. I can tell you our view, but I'm not sure if anyone has a view on whether you can treat essentially uncertainty about your X values differently to uncertainty about your Y values in this case, where X is time and Y is what you're trying to forecast. Well, I can tell you how we handle this on our side is that we view all uncertainty as uncertainty about the forecast value. Because if you think of being uncertain about the timing, you're essentially uncertain about the forecast value in a wider window. So we essentially widen the window in which you consider uncertainty rather than, but if you're just uncertain about the level, then your window is fixed, but your level is changing. But ultimately everything is considered through the Y values you're predicting. And so from a modeling perspective, that's how we view it. From a user input perspective, it's perhaps more difficult and it's not something we thought about in detail or even sort of developed the models to deal with. But it's an interesting point where our models, we kind of treat uncertainty the same regardless of where it comes from. But for a user perspective, they often have different ways of arriving at the same uncertainty estimation for different reasons. So as before, this is the same plot as before, we had a pseudo observation, but this is actually provided with high certainty. So the forecast is actually pulled up to this point, and it's the same as before, I just didn't tell you it was highly certain before. So now it's pulled up to the same point and it's affecting sort of a wide range of values. But if we now had a case where these is actually uncertain, then the impact on the forecast is lessened because it's pulled up in the same way, but it's not pulled up as far and it's staying closer to our original forecast, even though every point is still being adjusted upwards. And this is allowing us to capture the uncertainty about this impact from a user perspective, and also including the fact that our models have their own measure of uncertainty from a probabilistic perspective. So we're just changing the variance at different levels. Okay, so we're changing the observation noise essentially. But this is essentially manifest through a variance parameter in the optimization. So you can see the difference in the two forecasts. And that's something we're working on, is sort of looking to the future. So I sort of end by summarizing a bit of what we talked about. So we've shown that combining input from our input and insight from industry professionals into our machine learning models helps to improve performance. We first started by looking at direct modulation of our predictions, and that improved performance somewhat. But when we changed to looking at pseudo observations, this further improved performance by having a wider impact, and also sort of really getting the most out of our machine learning models. Second, we kind of covered the fact that getting these systems to work in the real world is challenging. You need to you can constantly think about your user's perspective. Do they need to understand the models you're working with, and do they understand them, and do they understand what you're optimizing for, and have you maintained clarity around this? How quickly can you get them to interact with your models, and how are you building expectations around what your models can achieve, and also what your users should be providing to your models? We talked about the importance of developing the models with the change in the future in mind, so trying to collect what I've said is model agnostic inputs. And something that's a theme throughout this is continually needing to clarify your objectives and manage the expectations. And we also mentioned that simulating your users is valuable for informed discussion and motivating change in your models. So explaining why you're updating your models, and why they should view this as progress, and why they might want to change the way that they're providing inputs to your models. As I said at the start, this is an ongoing project. It's not yet complete. It's not sort of perhaps a typical machine learning model lecture where you say, I did this model and everything's better now. We're showing progress, but it's we're still yet to get to a sort of fully deployed state where this is out in the real world, and well, it is out in the real world, but it's not sort of stable and in a final state. And we're continuing to look at how different users use the models in different ways, how different use cases might require sort of different ways to provide inputs and ways to affect the models. And as I sort of covered at the end here, we're also thinking about users might have different levels of uncertainty with which they're providing the input, and we want to account for that to not have certainty as a barrier to using our models. Cool. So that's everything I have to say in the slides. This is a picture I found when I Googled Alberta, so I'm sure, I hope it's as useful over there as this picture. But I think there are some more comments in the Discord, but I'm open to sort of wider discussion. We don't have too much time left, but I can hang around for a while.
That's actually right in my backyard. I just look out and see that.
Ah, nice. Well, why are you using the Zoom background then? You should open your windows and keep it like that.
So then Rohan had the question in the chat.
Okay, so when you have to create user models for a wide range of industries, how much domain-specific expertise do you need as the model designer versus relying on the model itself to capture underlying dynamics? So typically you need, you need quite a lot. Well, it depends on the problem, but often it's correlated with data set size. So if you don't have much data, you need more industry expertise because you can't learn it for yourself just from the data. But also there are certain, you will always need some industry expertise to try to first understand the data before you can then even think about using models. So understand the problem can then help you select a model, and then from your model, you then care about how much data you have and what the data looks like. So yeah, because it also depends on what you need out of it. So in our case, where we don't have much data and having a distribution out of your model so you can handle uncertainty is useful. It's useful to use a Gaussian process or a Bayesian approach. But in cases where you have a lot of data and you don't care about uncertainty, then you can use a neural network, and maybe that's better. Or you can't use a Gaussian process because you have too many data, or the data is very high dimensional. So I think it's in part what your data looks like, and then the specifics of the problem will then define how much industry insight you need. It's very hard to talk about in an abstract way without having a problem in front of you, I think. But I think in general, the less data you have, the more industry insight you need. So another question of, has there been any work done to allow a user to contribute a feature to the model? Maybe a user notices that Chinese New Year coincides with demand. Could you have a feature for that added? So what we found is that with models like this, okay, so at the design phase, when you're designing the models, you can add features. Adding features which is what we did in our case, where we added features for all of these recurring but so recurring, but not at different times of year every year events. So we let them, we essentially, we now know that that's very important to our models, and we provide these as features. But adding features on the fly, there is some work on that. I'm not too familiar with it.
So one thing I saw work out of Microsoft by Ajay Kumar, looking at, can we identify when we realize we don't have enough information? So for instance, if you're simulating traffic and a user is saying, oh, get out of the way of this car, but not this other car, that could be because the first car is a police car with their siren on. And you might be able to realize that I'm missing something. It won't be able to tell you what the feature is, but it could help you identify that I don't have the right feature set to be able to discriminate between these two cases where the user is telling me different things should happen.
Okay, for us, in our case, I guess we capture that through the uncertainty of the model as captured by the sort of output distribution you get. So yeah, it might be able to say when you don't have enough information and ask for more, but as to working out what that information is, or even kind of, adding different, once well, at least from our current perspective, once the sort of inputs and outputs of the model are kind of defined, you can add more inputs, you can't add more dimensionality to the inputs. And that would require, just retraining the model, which in our case is quite cheap, but for other models is I imagine more expensive.
Well, Ian, we're now a minute over, but I thank you a lot for coming and talking to us. I know you said, this isn't really completely deployed. I spent so much of my time looking at Atari. It's so great to see real world data sets actually doing real things. And it was really fun to hear about the awesome research you're doing at Prowler. I think I'm going to turn off streaming and recording, and I know some people need to leave, but if you had a few more minutes, maybe you could talk to us a bit more about Second Mind and what you're looking for in people that you hire, because I know a lot of students might be interested in that. So, all right, thanks for coming, everyone. And if you can't stick around, no worries.